Morning, everyone. Just realised that as that went live there, I was shuffling my papers like a newsreader. So obviously they genuinely do it. It's not for show. I'll wait for a few people to join and then we'll get started. Hi, Lynn. So, morning and welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna, the 49th in the series. So we're getting closer and closer to that 1 year anniversary. My name is Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. And the Highland Archive Service is the archive service for the Highlands, which covers a huge geographical area, about the third of the land mass of Scotland. And we have 4 archive centres. We have one in Inverness, one in Portree, one in Fort William, and one in Wick. And so today we are looking at a different subject from anything we've looked at previously. We're looking at one of the particular uses of the collections and some things that can be found within the collections relating to that. Before I go any further, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you are able to donate, then we are truly grateful for it, and I know certainly people who are watching have done so, and it really is very much appreciated by the whole team. This week we're moving on to a different theme. So for February I looked at some collections to do with education, to do with childhood, children in the poorhouses, education records, things like that. But today we're moving on to the theme for March, which is stories and illustrations. So I've been really excited about this one, and I've really enjoyed putting it together. So I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know. As you will no doubt know about me by now, having looked at my house, books and stories and life stories and experiences are really important to me, and they are in my kind of, as I say, in my personal life of reading and so on, but also in my role in my work. They're really important to gather people's stories, the stories of people and places and experiences, and to share them with people. It's really what kind of drives a lot of what I do and what I enjoy about it. So I've been really looking forward to this one, and particularly pleased that it goes out on World Book Day. So I'm looking forward to sharing these stories with you. So hello to everyone who's saying hello. Yes, and I'll answer that. Yes, dreich means grey and dark and miserable and wet. And don't tell us about your sunshine, Jenny. It'll be too upsetting. Okay, so the collections that we look after in the Highland Archive Service, as I say, are full of stories. So they're both full of stories, but also they inspire stories. The collections that I've looked at over this past nearly a year with you show all the experiences of, the human experiences that can be found in our collections. So these stories are not kind of dusty and dry, boring records. These are stories of people and places and relationships and loves and fears and heartbreaks and murders and war and battle and all sorts of different things, political dramas, religious conflicts, the gold rush, the slavery, the slave trade. All of those things can be found within our collections. So why would they not be a logical place for stories to be found and to be written? I've got at least one book in me. I can't tell any of you what it's about because I'm terrified that someone else will take it and write it. So I can't ever tell anybody what I want to write. So I'm going to split today's talk into different sections to try and showcase the different relationships we have with books in the Archive Service. So I'm going to split it into how we work with authors to share information about our collections, how we facilitate creative writing and performance based on our collections, and how that can lead to fact or fiction, some examples of authors and creative writers who have used our collections and what they've done with them, and then also authors who are represented within our collections. So how are authors and writers found within the archive material as well as reacting to the archive material? So first of all, I wanted to start with talking a little bit about how we enable authors to learn about what we hold. So obviously our collections are online now. I can hear an amen from everybody, mostly the staff. We also have done some events specifically for authors. So we have worked with writing groups, we've worked with local writing groups and national bodies. So we had the marvellously named Scooby in, which is the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And they came to see the sort of things that we held and how they could be, how they could incorporate aspects of the factual material we hold into children's stories. We also deal with a lot of inquiries that come in from individuals, individual writers and authors who want to find exact details to ensure that what they're writing has historical accuracy and there's no glaring errors in it. So, for instance, valuation rolls are a great resource for that, because people will contact us to say, you know, I just want to double check before I, you know, make a big blunder in a book that that street name hasn't changed, or that building existed as I've got someone walking past it. Did it actually exist? Can I just double check that? Things like car registration. So we hold the registers of vehicle motor registrations. So things like that can be used to check a date that something happened, or where the registration numbers were up to in a certain year. Things like that, just to get accuracy in stories that people are writing. Sometimes they contact us for a general sense of something, and myself and my colleague Jamie, who works in Ambala, had this a few months ago, where an author contacted us to say, I just want to know whether this seems to you, as people who are in your records all the time, does this seem a likely thing to happen at this time period? Because technically I know it could have happened, but would it have been so unlikely that it would distract the reader and make them think, oh, that's not quite right? So things like that we deal with writers for. And Ambala, as I say, Jamie there often gets a lot of inquiries of things to do with that, of just double checking information. And of course, supplying images and things to go alongside text. We have a lot of really great relationships with some local authors, and I can't name them all, so please don't phone me and say, you don't matter, I don't matter to you, because you definitely do. I couldn't name them all, but for instance, we work a lot with Jennifer Morak Henderson, with Norman MacDonald, with Barbara Henderson, the children's author, Jim Hunter's fabulous books about the history of the Highlands, Margaret Kirk, who's a crime writer, lots of other writers across the Highlands who come in and work with us. And we work with writers in different ways, as well as providing information to them. We run events with them. So, for instance, we ran an event in 2015 to mark the 300th anniversary of the 1715 Jacobite uprising. And one of the speakers at that was the absolutely marvellous local historian and writer Jim Miller, who is known with us among the staff as, you know, the Bible of all things. If we need to double check something, Jim's likely to know it as well. We host book launches. So I've mentioned Jim Hunter, and I've mentioned Jim Hunter several times throughout this series, who is a fantastic author of all sorts of aspects of Highland history. And so, for instance, we have been involved in launches for his books Set Adrift Upon the World, which is about the clearances, and Insurrection, which is about the food riots. And we were involved in book launches for both of those because they're so rooted in the story of the Highlands. I'll come back a little bit later on to talk about books which are based largely on our collections. We also collaborate with other groups and organisations. So, for instance, for the last few years at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, we've worked alongside Eden Court to take part in Ness Book Fest. So this is a book festival run out of Inverness. And that event that we run is local drama students who come in, read extracts from our collections, decide which ones they want to pick, and then perform monologues of them. So that's our original documents being directly communicated to a book-loving audience. And people who are involved in book festivals are there because they have an affinity with people's stories. And as I said, everything we hold is about stories. And using those drama students is a great way to communicate those stories to local authors and to local book-loving audiences as well. We've run some fabulous creative writing projects across the service, encouraging both individual adults and children of all ages to go into our collections, to be inspired by a document or an image, and to write something inspired by it. And I wanted to share one example of this with you. It's a 2-page story, and I'm going to read it all. So it is not the shortest extract I've ever read to you, but I feel it absolutely merits being shared. So I really hope you enjoy it. And please do let me know, because if you do, then I can share that on with the school where the pupil went. So this is a project we run very often with Milburn Academy. So every year we have students in from Milburn Academy in Inverness. They come in, look at the collections and find, it can be a story, it can be one image, it can be anything at all, and use that as a spark to write a story. This story that I'm going to read to you was written by a 13-year-old boy. So just bear that in mind. A 13-year-old boy. And it was inspired by one letter that we hold, in which a lady called Huguette Verhaeghe describes her experiences in the French resistance, protecting British airmen and standing up against the SS banging at her door. So this is a real letter that she wrote. But inspired by that, this boy took aspects of that story, of that letter, and wrote this story. And I wanted to share it with you. It's called The Picnic Place. Engines roared overhead, and not for the first time that night Huguette's house rattled. The house was pitch dark. Darkness. Huguette hated it. Not knowing her surroundings apart from little tips and taps. She was hiding under the kitchen table, shivering. Outside she could hear her world crumbling. The sound, it pierced right through her. Bombs exploding, people crying, and screams of pure human agony combined into a cacophony that could send you into insanity. Rain clattered onto the tiled roof, taking advantage of Huguette's fear. Bang! Huguette shifted towards the door, edging nearer and nearer to her fate. She heard a knock at the door. She opened the door to find a stocky man standing in front of her. The man dived into the house, nearly taking Huguette out as he did so. Her world turned black, and she felt like she was floating on air. Huguette woke up lying in her bed. She looked left, she looked right, her eyes skimming over the stocky man standing in the doorway. She went to scream, but he covered her mouth. Huguette panicked and lashed out and caught the man on his knee. The man recoiled in pain, falling down like timber. It was then in an exhausted, wheezy voice that he said, "You've got to help me. You've got to hide me." He wheezed. "Last night my plane crashed near the village chapel. I was away from the scene before the Gestapo arrived. My name's Alan," he said, reaching out to hold her hand. 1 year later. Since Alan's arrival, he and Huguette had got to know each other. Huguette cared for Alan. She cared for him a lot, and he felt the same way, but neither would admit it. Alan had struggled to fit into French culture. His French was broken, and when he was called upon, he would just stand there like a lemon. It was common knowledge in the village that Alan, or his French name Alain, was in fact not French at all, and it only took one person to grass Alan up, and his time here would be up. Huguette and Alan were on one of their morning walks, which had become part of their routine since autumn had come along. These walks were a great time for the two to get to know each other better. The scenery in the French countryside was beautiful, and Alan and Huguette would have picnics along the walk. At these picnics they would socialise, and they would eat food like sandwiches and cakes which Huguette had made. The picnic place. Their picnic place. It was where Alan had finally told Huguette how he felt about her. That day, when they had got up to the picnic place, Alan had asked a question. "Will you marry me?" he'd stuttered. Huguette was shocked but happy at the same time. "Yes," she replied, and he slipped a beautiful ring onto her finger. It was a fortnight after Alan had proposed. The two of them were listening to the latest war news on the radio, and what happened next was exactly what Huguette and Alan didn't expect. The door burst open again, and two men wearing uniforms ran in and started barking orders in German. That night Huguette ran. She ran into the moonlight. She heard a shot in the distance. She twisted her ring, knowing that she would never see her true love again. Tears, salty tears ran down Huguette's face. It was weeks after the incident, but she couldn't stop reminiscing. She had put flowers at the picnic place. Their picnic place. You see, this is going to be like the second or third time you've caught me welling up in this series. I find that an extraordinary piece of writing. The original document is moving enough and powerful. This is somebody in the French resistance writing to somebody in the Highlands, a friend of hers, explaining what she'd gone through during the Second World War. And for me, for a 13, 14-year-old boy to take that story and create something so beautiful out of it with such a connection to the story of the people, for me, serves an absolutely massive purpose. It's one of my favourite projects every single year to work with school pupils at Milburn Academy. And one of my fantastic responses that I had, that I treasure most in my 7 years in the archive service, was the school saying that coming in to take part in these events facilitates conversations, that it's changing what the pupils are talking about at school. They're talking about mental health, or they're talking about fear and conflict. And that, for me, is absolutely powerful and vital. So I think it's vital to remember in doing this that the people we're talking about are real people. They're real stories. So we can create fiction around them. We can use them to give a spark of inspiration to write something. But it's also important to acknowledge the real life behind these, and to never take away from that this is a real lived experience of a person who existed. But as I say, doing this can open up big important conversations, and that's really important. I think it's archives as a tool to open those doors. So I said I would talk about some of the books that are written largely based on our collections. Now, again, there are many, many books which have been written using our archive collections, and I will not be able to talk about them all. But I wanted to just highlight a couple of them to show the different purposes that come out from this. So, for instance, Roger Hutchinson has used the archive collections in Skye extensively to write about the Glendale Martyr. It's a book. The book is a phenomenal overview of a really important time period and a time in Skye's history. So you can use archive material to give an overview of a big important subject, as Roger Hutchinson has done. I've got some things I prepared earlier, now that I've managed to calm the tears in my eyes down from that boy's reading. This is an example, this book by Alan Tritton, called When the Tiger Fought the Thistle. And this is a story that is based almost entirely on collections that we hold at the Highland Archive Service. This is the story of William Bailey of the Madras Army. And Alan Tritton, to write this book, went through, I remember because I photocopied many, many, many of them for him, went through absolutely dozens and dozens and dozens of bundles of letters in our Bailey of Denane collection. So there were hundreds of letters. And the reason he did that, a huge amount of in-depth research, was to get insights into the personality of the person who was the kind of the subject of his book, but also to get insight into the personalities and actions of the people around him. And the reason he wrote this book was to try and, with the aim of changing Bailey's lasting reputation and legacy, because William Bailey has been held up as someone who was accountable for a military failure. And Alan Tritton felt this was not a fair legacy for him, and so delved into our collections and collections held in the national collections as well, to try and reassess what his legacy was. So you can use archive material to reassess evidence. In the case of this book, which is one of my favourites, purely because I've got a mention in the back of it, which makes me feel like if I never get round to writing my book, at least I am published in a book. This book is about the Loch Ness Monster, and so this was written to assess whether evidence exists at all. So Gareth Williams, who wrote this, went through our collections to look for evidence of Loch Ness Monster spottings and how that was treated by the press, by the publicity, whether it was a tourist stunt in the 1930s, all sorts of things. So again, using it for a slightly different reason. In this series of books, which I know I've mentioned before, The Hospitals of the Highlands, Steve and Jim Leslie have gone extensively through our Highland Archive Service the records that are held by NHS Highland, on behalf of NHS Highland, to look at the history of the hospitals of Inverness and the wider Highlands. This one particularly is the Hospitals of Inverness, but it's a series that uncovers the history of healthcare across the Highlands. So there's one for Skye, there's one for Nairnshire. And these are, based very intensely on the collections that we care for. And in turn, they then become a really useful resource for us to go to encourage people to start with this and then come and look at the original material. And of course, the Highlands played such an important role in the development of healthcare and the development of the National Health Service. Yes, Fiona, the book is very interesting, very helpful. And also Jim Leslie is responsible for one of my absolute favourite quotes about archives, when he said archives are the things that can, when we meander down a route, kind of misremembering what we think was our past, archives are the thing that will bring us back and say that actually isn't the past, that's the past. And Jim and Steve spoke at our event a couple of years ago to mark the National Health Service 70th anniversary. So again, that collaboration with authors as well. Just seeing your question, when was the Loch Ness Monster first mentioned? Well, it really became a big thing in the 1930s, and then there's references back to Columba and much, much earlier references, but the big story kind of comes out in the 1930s. And don't quote me because I may not be correct, but I think the people who were involved initially were involved in ownership of a chain of hotels, and that was why there was the question of whether this had been a tourism thing. And then Lessons by Loch Ness. So this is another example similar to the hospitals one. This is written by my lovely colleague Anne Fraser, who some of you will know, who's our family historian, and she delved again through our education records to tell the story of education on the south side of Loch Ness. So a similar sort of thing of going right through that factual material to produce something quite comprehensive. So those are some of the ways that our collections are represented by writers. So what about the writers who appear in our collections? So before I come to that, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this. But again, if you're able to donate towards our work and enable us to keep doing these things, then we would very much appreciate that. Okay, so how are our authors represented in our collections? There's something of a discussion around that, because there's the difference between the search room shelves versus the strong room shelves. So often when people write books, so for instance, all of those books that I've referred to there appear on our search room shelves because they are in our reference library section, because they are relating to the history of the Highlands and they've been based on collections that we care for. Published books very rarely make their way into our strong room collections. The reason for that being that generally published material goes to a library. So normally we don't have published books within our archive collections because, of course, by and large, archive collections are unique and original material. But we do sometimes take them in if they're integral to a collection. So if they form a really important part of a business collection or a personal collection, then we will take them in. So I'm going to touch on some of those to talk about here. A good example is the Mary Beath collection. And I've sort of on and off mentioned Mary Beath over the weeks. Mary Beath collections D1443, so it was our 1443rd deposited collection at the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness. And that came to us in 2015. So Mary Beath was a writer. She was an expert on herbal medicine, traditional healing, traditional remedies, things like that, Gaelic history. She was a writer for the West Highland Free Press. She was an absolute expert in the field of herbal and traditional medicine, and it was often consulted by others about the subject. And we hold her personal papers. So this is a collection, an extensive collection of research notes, correspondence, papers, photographs, all sorts of things. And as part of that collection, we hold a copy of her book, Healing Threads, because it was an integral part of her work and her life. So that's an example of a personal collection about her life where the book is part of her story and therefore we have taken it in as part of the collection. A similar example of this, much larger, is the Ian Rankin archive that's held at the National Library of Scotland. So again, it's not an archive of his books, it's his personal archive, and then books will form part of that. He described it as a pretty complete author's life, late 20th century style. So it's the fact that it's the life that's important and the books are part of that. So we also hold business collections, which include published material. And probably the best example of this is the Sandstone Press archive, which we look after. So Sandstone is an independent publisher, was based in Dingwall, now based in Inverness. And they produce all sorts of a variety of books. So crime, fiction, outdoor books, biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, that sorts of things, all sorts of things. And that collection is a business, the business records. So there are draft works, there are photographs, there are folios and author info and promotional material about the company. And then as part of that, there are books that have been written by authors, and authors including some I've already mentioned, like Jennifer Morag Henderson. We hold originals of her published books within our archive collections because they fit into the business archives of Sandstone Press. Another example that I've already spoken about over the weeks is Duncan Mcpherson. You'll maybe remember I did one of these talks on the Duncan Mcpherson collection. And so we hold his business records from when he ran the pharmacy in Cailloch. But as part of that, there are travel books that he wrote. So again, they come in as an integral part of a wider collection. Another collection which includes an author's work, or in this case a poet's work, is the fantastic Mary Gwendolyn Mckenzie collection. Now, I love this. It's quite a small collection. It comprises an enormous scrapbook. Someday I must post a picture of the scrapbook so you can see it. It is about this thick and this size. It's enormous. All sorts of information in there. So Mary Gwendolyn Mckenzie was the wife of Duncan Davidson of Tulloch, and she was a poet. And that was the image that I used for this event of the Mink ballads with the drawings and the pens, the writing was written by Mary Gwendolyn. And so we hold both manuscript books of her work and also some published booklets of hers in the collection. And I wanted to read two of these to you. One was written in 1941 and it's called The Casualty List. And it reads, "With dread, I scan the list of names each passing day, and then, with thankful heart relieved, go on my way. No name I know is there, but others may see the name of one beloved, though quite unknown to me. For each one printed there in the war who took his part, in some once happy home there is now a broken heart." And again, I find that it's a very powerful piece of writing, and I think at the moment it's a powerful piece of writing because we're all kind of living through that with COVID, where there's, you're conscious, and our politicians say it all the time, and our healthcare experts say it all the time, that for every number there's somebody sitting at home crying for that person. It's a very similar experience, that just because maybe it hasn't had a personal impact on you, it has had a personal impact on somebody. And again, just that reoccurrence of the human experience. So, as I say, that was written in 1941, but to lighten the mood a little bit from all my emotional stories today, listen to this poem. This is written by the same lady, Mary Gwendolyn Mckenzie, or Davidson, and this was written in 1892, and it's dedicated to her husband, Duncan Davidson. And so she's written the title, "The Hay-Fevered Husband, dedicated to D.D. with all respect, his wife, Mary Gwendolyn Mckenzie." I love this. As a hay fever sufferer, I take great sympathy in this poem. "He has gone from my gaze like a nightmare at dawn, with a flea in his ear and his side whiskers torn. In housecoat and gaiters and pain in his feet, he's cast off his collar because of the heat. He flew over the hay with a mowing machine and trampled the grass down before it was green. He watered the rose beds and swept up the dust. For a cure of his hay fever, he felt that he must. He next went to the stables and dragged out the straw and oiled all the horses. He'd done that before. He raked out the ashes and put in some sticks and extinguished the fire with furious kicks. Having taken this trouble, he felt he was free from this fever of hay, but mistaken was he. For now that around him the dust was laid low, to a party of pleasure he felt he could go. He entered the train and there met his doom. His face grew quite sad, with side whiskers of gloom. For in at the window and in at the door blew oceans more dust than he'd ever met before. He sneezed and he coughed and he blew his nose. He rubbed at his eyes and he tore off his clothes. He ground out his teeth and he kicked off his feet. As he reached it, he tore at his hair and then rolled off his seat. Thus hay fever slew him. On the floor he expired. Of moderate hay fever at home he was tired. He remembered the dust of the railway too late, and in seeking for pleasure he there met his fate. Love that. So yes, that's maybe Gwendolyn. There are also people represented in our collections who we know were prolific or famous writers or authors, but the collections don't focus on it. So, for instance, the Baron family of Inverness Courier fame, and this is just one volume of Baron's 3-volume Northern Highlands in the 19th century, History of the Highlands. So you can see this is, a famous, a prolific writer. This is, as I say, one of 3 volumes. And the family papers that we hold in the business papers, as I say, they were responsible for running the Inverness Courier, don't include any original books like this. The other example of that, or another example of that, is the Fraser Tytler collection, which I've spoken about before, my absolute favourite collection. And yes, Jenny, I know I say that most weeks. Both collections include letters from authors, letters from publishers in the 1700s, 1800s, opinions on texts, reviews, feedback, but no actual copies of their books. Both include a lot of references to authors, to other authors, because of course people who are in literary families know other literary families, and they move in that network, and you can see that these are people who both of those families are corresponding in their own time frame, and when they were with different authors, with different writers, looking for reviews, looking for comment. So there's a lot of that within these collections, a lot of correspondence, both about their own books and writing to publishers or getting responses back, but also from other writers who are writing to them saying, please, can you give me comment on my text? So there's a lot of correspondence around reviews, publication, literary criticism, that sort of thing. And then there are collections that only come about because of a book. And a great example of this is Chris Watley's book, Pabby. It's called Pabby, an Island Odyssey. And it's the story of the Isle of Pabby, which sits within Skye's Inner Sound. And Chris had used the archive collections in Skye to research aspects of this story. It was a story that was of great emotional importance to him, a family story. And so he had used oral histories, he'd used family reminiscences, photographs, things like that, and the archive collections held in Skye and Loch Alsh to try and tell the story of the island of Pabby. And then, so, that's the part that I was talking about first. The author has come to us for information. But then subsequently, on the back of the book being published, Chris had then deposited the information with us. So he's deposited his family papers, his photographs, and his research notes following the publication of the book. So it comes full circle. The collections have given inspiration and given information to the end of publishing the book, and then the book and its material comes to us to look after as well, so that more people can be inspired by the book and then come in to find out more. So that's a really nice example of that. That collection wouldn't exist without the book being written. So those are just some of the ways that we interact with authors, and that the work of writers is interlaced within our collections. But I wanted to finish by just mentioning a collection that we hold in Nucleus, Nuclear and Caithness archives, which is slightly different again, but is a lovely example of something which showcases the work of local Caithness writers in the 1860s. And this is a magazine called The Peripatetic. So this was a concept created in Thurso in 1861. And the purpose of this, it was a magazine, it was a hand-created magazine that would be produced quarterly, and that would contain stories and essays and illustrations and interpretive thoughts about things and watercolours and all sorts of things created by the people of Caithness for the people of Caithness, created and written by local people. And it's important, as I kind of round this talk off, to say it again, as I've said so many times on different subjects, it's not about the great and the good. Of course, there's a role in those kind of high-flying people to be in our collections, and that's absolutely vital. And it's vital that the likes of Ian Rankin's collections are held. But it's also equally important that the people who have come together in a community to create this local opinion, local thoughts, local stories, that is of equal importance to us. And Nucleus holds 4 bound copies of the Peripatetic from 1864. And I wanted to just finish by reading you a really short extract from one of them, because I thought it was it's just a nice little reading. And it's, you can't see it, of course, as I'm talking, but it's beautifully illustrated. It's in beautiful calligraphy. If they haven't, I'm not sure yet whether Nucleus have had that on their Facebook page, but if they haven't, maybe they will put that up and you can have a wee look at it. And it reads, 2 brothers, slumber and sleep, called to the service of the gods, were entreated by Prometheus to descend to earth for the consolation of his race. But that which was so light to the gods was too heavy for man to bear, and thus their slumber became our sleep, and their sleep became our death. Which I just thought was beautiful. So as I say, an important chance for local people to write and to illustrate. And again, that's going back to that story from Milburn that we started with. That's just as important. It's important that people have a voice to write and to create, and that we share and look after those. I hope you've enjoyed this week's talk. As I said, I really enjoyed putting it together. I have a passion for books, and it was lovely to share that with you. Jenny, I'm absolutely up for cake for the 1-year anniversary. I'll send you my address. You can send me some cake. Yes, we're coming up to it. We'll do something to mark it, don't worry. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this week's talk, and I hope you can join me next week when we'll be looking at the story of Mary Vore, who was a famous poet and writer and singer from the Isle of Skye. And that, just in the way this was kind of chosen to mark World Book Day, we'll be looking at International Women's Day next week. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about a little bit about Mary Vore. So thank you so much. I'm really glad to see people's messages coming in saying they enjoyed it. We'll make sure that Milburn see those so that they can be passed on to the pupils to know that their works are appreciated. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no subscription required to take in these events. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.